At 74 years old, Cora Mae Tillman walked into a restaurant wearing the same wool coat she had owned for 19 years, and the owner told her to leave before she'd even reached a table. What that man didn't know was that 4 hours earlier, Cora had signed her name to a document that made her the owner of the ground he was standing on. It was the second Tuesday in November, and Beaufort County had already gone cold. The kind of cold that comes up off the river before dawn and settles into your hands and won't leave till noon. Cora parked her late husband's pickup truck across the street from the building on Hartwell Avenue and sat there a while with the engine off, watching the windows light up one by one. The sign over the door said, "The Hartwell now." Black letters, gold edges, a little lamp under it so you could read it at night. There was a man inside straightening the chairs. For 38 years, that same building had said something else. Tillman's Kitchen. Hand-painted, white on green, by a man named Otis who had never once in his life paid for a thing he could do himself. Cora got out of the truck. She crossed the street slow, the way her knees made her go now, and she pushed open the door she had pushed open 10,000 times. The smell hit her first. It was wrong. Rosemary and butter and something burnt on purpose, the way the young chefs liked it. No collard greens, no smoke, no coffee that had been sitting since 5 in the morning. The floor was the same wide pine she and Otis had laid in 1974, but they'd stained it dark and put little gold lamps on every table, and there were prices on a chalkboard that made her blink twice. A man came toward her, late 30s, maybe 40. He had a soft, clean face and a gray sweater that probably cost more than her truck was worth. And he was smiling, but it was the kind of smile a man uses to move you back out a door, not bring you in. "Can I help you?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "I'd like a table," Cora said. "Just for myself. By the window, if you've got one." The man looked at her coat. He looked at her shoes, which were good shoes, church shoes. But they were 9 years old and he knew it. He looked at the canvas bag over her shoulder. "We don't open till 5 for dinner," he said. "And we're fully committed tonight, private event." "It's 2 in the afternoon," Cora said gently. Like I said, he stepped a little closer, and his voice dropped, friendly and final, all at once. "Ma'am, I think you might be looking for the community center. They do a hot lunch over on Pine, I believe. Tuesdays and Thursdays." There it was. She had heard that voice her whole life. It came dressed up nice, and it always meant the same thing. "My name is Cora Tillman," she said. "I'd just like to sit down." "I'm sure you would." He had his hand near her elbow now, not touching but hurting. Behind him, 2 women at the bar had turned to watch, holding their wine, and a young waiter near the kitchen door had gone very still. "This isn't really the kind of place for that, you understand? I've got paying guests coming. Why don't you head on out and there's no trouble?" "I can pay," Cora said. The man laughed. "Just a little, just enough." "I'm sure," he said again. "Come on now, don't make this a thing." And he opened the door for her, the same door her husband had hung on its hinges with his own 2 hands, and he held it, and the cold came in, and Cora Mae Tillman stepped back out onto Hartwell Avenue, because a younger woman raised the way she'd been raised did not make a scene, even when every part of her wanted to. The door closed. The little lamp over the Hartwell sign buzzed on against the gray afternoon. Cora stood on the sidewalk and breathed. In through the nose, out slow. Her heart was going hard, but her hands were steady, and that surprised her. 40 years ago, her hands would have shaken. She had learned a few things since then. She walked back to the truck. She did not cry. She sat behind the wheel, and she looked at the building, and she said, out loud, to nobody, to Otis, "Well, that answers that." Then she looked at her watch. It was 2:11. To understand why Cora Tillman wasn't shaking, you have to go back. You have to understand the building, and the man who built it into something, and the 38 years that happened inside those walls before a stranger in a gray sweater put her out on the sidewalk like a stray. Otis Tillman came back from the Army in 1969 with a bad knee and $400 and an idea. He'd been a cook in the service, big steel kitchens, 200 men 3 times a day, and he'd loved it. Loved the heat and the noise and the way a plate of food could put a man back together. When he got home to Beaufort County, there wasn't a single place on that side of town where a working family could sit down and be served a decent meal and not be made to feel small about it. So he made one. He bought the building on Hartwell when it was a failed feed store with a hole in the roof. He bought it cheap because nobody else wanted that corner. He fixed the roof himself. He met Cora Mae Pruitt at the church on Calloway Street the same spring, and he married her that fall. And the two of them opened Tillman's Kitchen in the summer of 1971, with a stove they'd bought used and a sign Otis painted on his knees in the alley. Cora was 20 years old. She could cook before she could read. Her grandmother had seen to that. And Otis used to say that the only smart business decision he ever made was putting Cora in charge of the food and himself in charge of getting out of her way. They worked. Lord, they worked. Open at 5 for the men going to the mill, closed at 9 when the dishes were done and the floor was mopped and the next day's beans were soaking. Cora's gumbo on Fridays. Her sweet potato pie, which the preacher said was a sin to be that good. Collard greens cooked down slow with a ham hock and a tablespoon of sugar and a secret she never told anybody, not even her own daughter, until the very end. 38 years. They raised 2 children in the apartment over the kitchen. They put both of them through school on plates of food, $1.10 at a time. They buried Cora's mother and Otis's brother and stood at more funerals at the Calloway Street Church than either of them could count. And after every single one, the family came to Tillman's, and Cora fed them, and nobody ever saw a bill. The men who'd been put out of nicer places came to Tillman's and were never put out of anything. That was the whole point of it. Otis used to stand at the door on a Sunday after church, in his apron, and shake every hand that came through, and he'd say, "You sit anywhere you like. Every table's the good table here. Every table's the good table here." He said it for 38 years. There was a man named Earl Dawkins who came in every morning at 5:30 for 26 years. He'd lost his wife young and never learned to cook, and he'd sit at the counter with the paper, and Cora would set down his eggs without him asking because she knew. 2 over easy, grits, no toast. When Earl's hands got too bad with the arthritis to hold a fork right, Cora started cutting his sausage for him before she brought the plate out, quiet, so nobody saw, so he never had to feel it. She did that for the last 4 years of his life and never said a word about it to anybody. That was the kind of place it was. That was the kind of thing that doesn't make it into a magazine article about a corner getting class. The trouble came the way trouble usually comes, which is slow and then all at once. Otis's knee got worse, then his heart. He kept cooking with a cane hooked over the prep counter until the doctor sat Cora down and told her if that man stood over a stove one more winter, she'd be a widow by spring. So in 2009, they closed Tillman's Kitchen. Not because it failed, because the body that built it gave out. They were both nearly 60 and tired in their bones, and the children were grown and gone, one to Atlanta and one to the Navy, and there was nobody to take it over. They didn't sell the building. That's the part the man in the gray sweater never thought to ask about. Otis would not sell that corner. He'd bled into that corner. He leased it instead to a man who promised to keep it a family place. And that man kept it 3 years and sold his lease to another man. And that man to another. And somewhere in there, the promise got lost the way promises do when the people who made them are gone. Otis died in the spring of 2011. He went easy in his sleep, in the apartment over the kitchen where his children had been born. And Cora held his hand until it went cold. And then she got up and made coffee because that was the only thing her hands knew how to do at 5 in the morning. She had the building. She had his small pension and the life insurance and the savings 2 careful people put away a little at a time over half a century. She had a paid-off house on Calloway Street. She was not a rich woman, but she was not a poor one either, no matter what a stranger thought when he looked at her coat. And she had something else. She had every paper Otis ever signed, in a green metal box under the bed, because Otis Tillman did not throw away a single document in his entire life, and he taught his wife to do the same. For 10 years after Otis passed, Cora let the building be. The lease money came in. She didn't need much. She kept the house. She kept her garden. She sang in the choir. And once in a while, she'd drive past the corner on Hartwell and see whatever it had become that year, and she'd keep driving. Then last spring, the lease money stopped coming. The man who held the lease now was named Preston Vale. He'd taken it over 2 years back and turned the place into the Hartwell, a fine dining spot, the kind that got written up in the regional magazine with photographs of tiny food on big white plates. For a while it did well, then it didn't. Cora didn't know all the reasons. She only knew that the rent came late, and then later, and then it came with a letter full of words like restructuring, and temporary, and partner. She was patient. She was a patient woman. But by October, the man owed her 11 months, and her daughter Renee, who handled her mother's papers now and worked as a paralegal in Atlanta, drove up and sat at the kitchen table on Calloway Street and laid it all out plain. "Mama," Renee said, "he's not behind. He's done. I pulled the records. He's in default on his business loans. He's got liens, and the bank that holds his other debt is about to take everything he's got that isn't nailed down, including, maybe, his interest in your building, if we're not careful." Cora poured her daughter more coffee. "What do you mean, my building?" "I mean, he stopped paying you because he's broke, and a broke man with lawyers can make your life hard before the end." "But Mama," Renee leaned forward, "there's another way to look at this. Here's the thing nobody in the Hartwell knew when they put Cora Tillman out on the sidewalk. The building 2 doors down, the old hardware store, had gone into foreclosure that fall, and the bank, looking to clear its books before the new year, had bundled it with another property it held a note on, and was selling both at a county auction. Renee, going through the filings the way she went through everything, careful and slow, had found the second property in the bundle. It was the corner lot on Hartwell Avenue, not Cora's building. Cora owned that free and clear. But the land beside it and behind it, the parking, the alley where Otis had painted the sign, the strip that any restaurant on that corner needed to so much as put out a delivery truck. A previous owner had split the parcels back in the 90s, and Preston Vale, in his hurry to look like a big man, had never bothered to find out that he didn't actually own the ground his own kitchen door opened onto. He leased the building from Cora. The land around it belonged to a note the bank was now dumping at auction for pennies. "You buy that lot," Renee said, "and you don't just own your building. You own his whole operation. His patio, his parking, his back door. Every truck that brings him a single tomato crosses dirt you'd hold the deed to. Mama, he can't run that place without you. He just doesn't know it yet." Cora was quiet a long time. Outside, a cardinal was working the feeder Otis had built. "How much?" she said. Renee told her. It was a number. It was a real number. A serious number. Most of what two careful people had saved across 50 years. It was the kind of number that made an old woman's stomach go cold. Cora thought about the man in the magazine photographs. She'd seen the article. Preston Vale, standing in the doorway her husband built, arms crossed, calling it his vision, talking about how he'd taken a tired old corner and given it class. There'd been a line in there that stuck in her like a splinter. The reporter had asked about the building's history, and Preston Vale had said, and they printed it, "Honestly, before us, this was just a greasy spoon nobody would remember. We gave this corner something it never had. Just a greasy spoon nobody would remember. 38 years, 2 children raised in the rooms upstairs, 10,000 plates of food carried out to people who'd been turned away everywhere else." "Buy it," Cora said. The auction was that Tuesday morning. Renee handled it by phone the way they do it now, and Cora sat at her own kitchen table in her good blue dress with her hands folded and listened to her daughter's voice on the speaker, calm and even saying numbers. It went quick. Nobody else wanted a scrubby corner lot in a part of town the money had forgotten. At 10 minutes past 11 on that cold Tuesday morning, Cora Mae Tillman became the owner of the ground that ran under and around and behind the Hartwell restaurant. And the papers were signed and notarized by 1:30. And then, because she was a human being and not a saint, Cora got in Otis's truck and drove down to Hartwell Avenue. She told herself she just wanted to see it, to sit in her own building one time, quiet, before whatever came next. To order a cup of coffee at a table by the window where she used to set out the day's pie, and to say a little goodbye to the old place, and a little hello to whatever she was about to make it become. She didn't go in there to teach anybody a lesson. She was too old and too tired for lessons. She went in there to sit down, and a man in a gray sweater put her out on the sidewalk and told her to go find a hot lunch over on Pine. Now it was 2:11 in the afternoon, and Cora Mae Tillman sat in her truck with her steady hands in her lap, and she did not cry, and she did not drive home. Because she had a 3 o'clock appointment, and she'd nearly forgotten it. Renee had set it up days ago, before any of them knew how the auction would go. With the land changing hands, somebody had to formally walk the property line and hand over the keys to the access gate on the alley and the survey markers, and the bank's closing agent had agreed to meet the new owner on site at 3 o'clock. On site, at the corner of Hartwell Avenue, Cora was the new owner. She was about to walk back into that building, and this time the man in the gray sweater would not be the one deciding who got to stay. She made herself wait. She bought a coffee from the gas station 2 blocks down in a paper cup, and she drank it slow in the truck and let the warmth get into her hands. And at 5 minutes to 3, she pulled the truck around to the alley behind the building. The alley Otis had painted the sign in, the alley she now owned every inch of, and she parked it square in the loading zone behind the Hartwell. Inside, Preston Vale was having the worst afternoon of his professional life, and it had nothing to do, yet, with the old woman he'd already forgotten. His phone had been going all day. The bank, his business partner, who had stopped using the word partner and started using the word lawsuit. The food distributor, who would not send another delivery until the last 3 invoices cleared. Preston had 31 paying guests coming for a private dinner at 5, a 40th birthday thing for a country club woman who'd put down a deposit he had already spent, and he did not have enough product in the building to feed them, and his line cook had walked out at noon. And at 3 o'clock his closing agent was coming. Preston had been told vaguely that the lot behind his building had changed hands and that he'd need to sign some access paperwork. He'd barely registered it. Some investor, he figured. Some out-of-town money. Fine. Maybe it was even good news. Maybe whoever bought it would want to buy him out. Give him a way out of this hole. He'd put on his best sweater for it. So when the knock came at the back door at 3 on the dot, Preston Vale opened it himself, smile already on, hand already out, ready to charm whatever suit the bank had sent. It was the old woman in the wool coat. For a second, his face just didn't know what to do. The smile stayed up while everything behind it fell. "We're closed," he said on reflex, the way you'd swat at something. "Ma'am, I told you—" "You did," Cora said. And then a younger woman stepped up beside her on the step, in a gray business suit, with a leather folder, and behind her a man in a windbreaker with a clipboard and a county lanyard. And the younger woman said, "Mr. Vale, I'm Renee Tillman. I represent the owner of the property. This is the closing agent from First Carolina. We have a 3 o'clock to walk the parcel and transfer the access easements. You'd have gotten the notice from the county on Friday." Preston looked at the suit. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the old woman. "The owner," he said. "Cora Mae Tillman," Renee said. "My mother. As of this morning, she holds the deed to the lot your loading dock, your patio, your parking, and your trash enclosure all sit on. She already owns the building you're leasing, so," Renee opened the folder, "we should probably talk inside. It's cold out here." There is a particular silence that falls on a man when the floor he's standing on turns out to belong to the person he just threw out the door. Preston Vale stood in it. "That's," he started. "There must be some— I lease this building from a holding account. I've never—" "You lease it from her," Renee said, not unkind, just plain. "You've been mailing your rent, when you mailed it, to a P.O. box that belongs to the Tillman Family Trust. The 11 months you're behind to her. And starting today, the land all around the building belongs to her too. We can do this standing in an alley, Mr. Vale, or you can let us in." He let them in. Cora Tillman walked back through the door of the building her husband built, and this time, nobody held it to push her out. The 2 women at the bar were gone. The young waiter was still there, the one who'd gone still that afternoon, and when he saw Cora come back in, his eyes went wide. And then slowly, something like a smile started at the corner of his mouth, and he looked down at the glasses he was polishing to hide it. Cora saw it. She filed it away. She had spent 38 years learning to read a room from behind a stove, and she could still tell, in 5 seconds, exactly who in a place was kind and who was not. They sat at a table by the window, the good table. Every table's the good table here, she thought, and almost smiled. Renee laid the papers out one at a time. The deed to the lot, recorded that afternoon, with the county seal still smelling of toner. The original 1971 deed to the building, in the name of Otis and Cora Tillman, 53 years old and soft as cloth. The lease Preston had signed 2 years ago, which he plainly had never read all the way through, because if he had, he'd have known whose name was on the other side of it. The 11 invoices, the default notice, the survey map showing, in clean black lines, exactly how a restaurant could come to sit on a piece of land it didn't own a single foot of. Preston Vale read them. His clean, soft face went gray as his sweater. He kept starting sentences. Look, Mrs. Tillman, there's clearly been I run a serious operation here. I have 30 guests coming tonight. A private event, very important people, and I'm sure we can find a way to. You owe me $11,400 in back rent, Cora said. It was the first thing she'd said since she sat down. Her voice was quiet and even. And as of this morning, you can't put a delivery truck behind this building, or seat a single guest on that patio, or empty your own garbage without my say-so. Your event tonight, where do you think the catering vans are going to park? Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I'll tell you what I know about running a restaurant, Cora went on. Since you mentioned in the magazine that this corner never had any class before you got here. She folded her hands on the table. I cooked in this room for 38 years. My husband built it. We laid that floor you stained over. We hung that door you held open for me 4 hours ago when you put me out in the cold. 40 years of people came through it who'd been turned away from every nice place in this county for looking like me. And not one of them, not one, in 38 years, ever got told to go find a hot lunch somewhere else. The young waiter had stopped pretending to polish glasses. He was just standing there listening, and his eyes were wet. You called this a greasy spoon nobody would remember, Cora said. Mister, the whole east side of this town remembers. They remember every Friday and every funeral and every plate my husband carried out with his bad knee because he believed a person ought to be able to sit down and eat with their dignity in one piece. She paused. You took 2 years to forget that. We took 38 to build it. Preston Vale, 40 years old, fine dining vision, photographs in the magazine, put his face in his hands at a table in a restaurant he didn't own, on land he didn't own, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he finally looked up, he wasn't smiling. He'd run out of smiles around the time he saw the county seal. What do you want? He said. It came out small. Please, just tell me what you want. I'll do it. I can't lose this place. It's everything I've got. I'm asking you. Please. There it was. An hour ago, he'd been asking her to leave. Now, he was asking her to stay. And here's where Cora Mae Tillman could have done what a smaller person would have done, what part of her surely wanted to do, which was to stand up and put him out on the sidewalk and let the cold have him the way he'd let it have her. Nobody on earth would have blamed her. But she had buried a man who shook every hand that came through his door, even the ones that didn't deserve it. And she had cooked for 40 years for people who'd never have set foot in a place like the one this man was begging to keep. And she had not driven down here, after everything, to learn how to be cruel at 74. So she did something else. She looked at him a long moment. Then she looked past him at the kitchen, her kitchen, the one she could have walked through blind. And she looked at the young waiter standing by the bar with tears on his face. And she made a decision that surprised even Renee. I'm not going to put you out, Cora said. Preston blinked. I'm not going to take your event tonight from those people who paid for it. And I'm not going to leave this building dark in the middle of November. She nodded toward the kitchen. But you're not running this place anymore. You don't have the money and you don't have the heart. And I've watched men with neither run a kitchen into the ground my whole life. Here's what's going to happen, she told him. The back rent he owed her, $11,400, she'd forgive, all of it, wiped clean, on 3 conditions. First, he signed over his lease and walked away by the end of the month, with no fight, no lawyers, no liens against her property. Renee had the papers right there. Walk away clean, and the debt died with the ink. Second, before he left, he'd do one thing for the country club woman's 40th birthday dinner that night. The one he couldn't afford to cook because his distributor had cut him off and his line cook had quit. You don't have any food in this building, Cora said. I do. I've got a deep freeze on Callaway Street full of what I put up from the garden this fall, and I can have my church ladies down here in an hour, and we are going to cook those 31 people the best supper they've ever had in their lives. Gumbo, greens, cornbread, my sweet potato pie. The food this corner was built on. She leaned forward. And you are going to stand at that door tonight, in your nice sweater, and shake every single hand that comes through it. And you are going to tell those important people exactly whose kitchen they're eating in, whose name should have stayed on that sign. Preston Vale stared at her. And the third condition, Cora said, is that boy, She pointed at the young waiter. He stays. Whatever I do at this place, he's got a job in it. Because 4 hours ago, when you put an old woman out in the cold, he was the only soul in this room who looked like he wanted to stop you. I saw it. A man who will feel bad and do nothing is still a coward, son, so don't let it sit too long next time. But you've got the right thing in you somewhere. We'll find work for it. The young waiter wiped his face with the back of his hand and nodded, fast, like a boy. His name's Marcus, Renee said quietly. She'd already learned it, of course. She learned everything. Marcus, Cora repeated. All right. That was how, on the second Tuesday in November, 31 country club guests in their good clothes came to the Hartwell for a 40th birthday dinner and were served gumbo and collard greens and skillet cornbread and sweet potato pie by an old woman in a wool coat and 6 ladies from the Calloway Street Church Choir in a kitchen that smelled, for the first time in 15 years, exactly the way it was supposed to. They had never tasted anything like it. One man, a banker by the look of him, in a jacket that cost more than Cora's whole stove, asked Marcus halfway through the gumbo if he could meet whoever made it, because he'd eaten in Paris and Charleston and New York, and he had never in his life had a bowl of anything that tasted like somebody's hands actually loved him. Marcus said the cook didn't come out of the kitchen, but he'd pass it along. The man wrote something on the back of his card and left it under his coffee cup. It was an address, and under it, in a careful hand, 2 words. Thank you. The birthday woman cried a little over the pie and didn't know why. And Preston Vale stood at the door in his gray sweater and shook every hand that came through. And when they asked him whose food this was, he told them. He told all of them. His voice cracked the first few times. By the end of the night, he was saying her name plain. Cora Mae Tillman. She used to own a place called Tillman's Kitchen, right here, on this corner. Best cook in 3 counties. This was her building. Still is. She didn't come out of the kitchen to be thanked. She never had. She stayed back by the stove with her ladies, the way she'd stayed back by the stove for 38 years. And she listened to a room full of people eating her food and going quiet the way people go quiet over a good meal. And it sounded exactly like 1985. It sounded like her whole life. The story might have ended there, a private thing, a good supper and a quiet justice. But Beaufort County is a small place, and the woman whose 40th birthday was happened to write a little column for the county paper. 3 days later, it ran on the front of the local section, with a photograph somebody had taken on a phone of Cora at the stove, mid-laugh, a wooden spoon in her hand. The headline said, "They put her out. Then she fed them all." The story went through that town the way a good story does, kitchen to kitchen, pew to pew. People who'd eaten at Tillman's Kitchen 40 years ago read it and called their grown children and told them the whole thing from the start, the way old people do. The mill, the funerals, the Friday gumbo. The preacher read it from the pulpit on Calloway Street, and the whole congregation already knew. And a magazine, the same regional magazine that had once printed Preston Vale calling the corner a greasy spoon nobody would remember, called Cora's daughter and asked, very politely, if Mrs. Tillman might sit for an interview about the history of the building and her plans for it. Because she did have plans. She'd had them since the night of the birthday dinner, since she'd stood at her old stove and heard her room go quiet over her food and felt something she hadn't felt since they closed the doors in 2009. Preston Vale signed his lease back over before the end of the month, just like he'd promised. No lawyers. He walked away clean. Last anybody heard, he'd moved to Charlotte and was managing the front of someone else's restaurant, a chain, the kind with laminated menus. And maybe that was the right size of thing for him after all. Cora never said an unkind word about him to a single reporter. When they asked, all she'd say was, he was young and he was scared, and he made a small choice. People can grow past a small choice, if they decide to, which was either grace or a warning, depending on how you'd treated her, and she let folks figure out which for themselves. She reopened the place in the spring. She didn't make it fine dining, and she didn't make it a museum. She made it Tillman's Kitchen again. Same green and white sign, repainted by a man at the church who'd learned the trade from Otis himself 30 years before. Open at 5 for whoever was up early. Gumbo on Fridays, pie on the counter, prices a working family could pay, and a back booth where twice a week, anybody who came in hungry and short could get a hot plate and be told to sit anywhere they liked, no questions. because every table was the good table. Marcus ran the floor. He turned out to be good at it, that boy. Gentle with the old folks and quick with the orders. And Cora was teaching him to cook on Sunday afternoons. Slow, the way her grandmother had taught her, starting with the greens and working up to the gumbo, which she said he could learn the day she decided to trust him with it, and not a day before. The collard greens secret she still kept. She told him he'd get it when she was ready and not when he asked, and he learned to stop asking, which was most of the lesson. The church ladies took shifts. Renee came up from Atlanta one weekend a month and did the books at the back table where her father used to do them, and shook her head and laughed at her mother for forgiving so much debt. And her mother said money was the cheapest thing she'd ever given anybody, and the easiest to make more of. And the look on a hungry person's face when you set down a plate was the expensive thing, and you couldn't get that back once you'd traded it for being right. Some evenings after the supper rush, Cora would sit at the table by the window with a cup of coffee gone half cold, in the building her husband built, on the land she'd bought back at 74, and she'd watch the light go down over Hartwell Avenue. She thought about the man in the gray sweater sometimes, not with hate. She was too old to carry that. It was too heavy, and she had too far left to walk. She thought about how he'd looked at her coat and decided he knew everything there was to know about her, and how wrong a person could be about another person in the 4 seconds it took to point them toward the door. She'd been put out of nicer places than the Hartwell in her life. She'd been put out of a lunch counter in 1962 when she was 12 years old, by a man who'd looked at her the same exact way, and she'd gone home and cried into her grandmother's apron, and her grandmother had held her and said a thing Cora had carried for 62 years. She'd said, "Baby, they can keep you out of their place, but you remember this. One day you're going to have a place of your own, and the only rule in it is going to be that nobody who's hungry leaves it empty. And that's how you win, not by keeping anybody out, by keeping the door open longer than they can stand." Cora kept the door open. She kept it open another 9 years, until she passed in her sleep at 83, in the apartment over the kitchen, the same room Otis had gone in, the same room their children were born in. And the morning she didn't come down to start the coffee, Marcus came up and found her, and he sat with her a while. And then he went downstairs, because there were people coming who'd be hungry, and he started the coffee, because that was the only thing his hands knew how to do at 5 in the morning, and he'd learned that from her. He runs it now. Tillman's Kitchen, on the corner of Hartwell Avenue. The greens are right, the gumbo is right, because she trusted him with it in the end, on a Sunday afternoon 2 years before she passed. And he wrote down every word in a blue spiral notebook he keeps in the green metal box under the counter, next to a 1971 deed soft as cloth and a front page clipping that says, "They put her out. Then she fed them all." There's a sign by the register now, hand-painted, that he did himself. It says the thing Otis used to say at the door on Sundays, the thing Cora said to a man who'd put her out in the cold, the thing that turned out to be the whole point of all of it. Every table's the good table here. People drive in from 3 counties to sit at them. A man in a gray sweater once looked at an old woman's coat and her shoes and her canvas bag and decided she didn't belong in his restaurant. He was right that she didn't belong there. It wasn't his restaurant. It never had been. It was hers, and the ground beneath it was hers. And the only thing he'd ever really owned was the choice of how to treat a stranger at his door. And he spent it badly. And she spent the next 9 years showing the whole county how it ought to be done. They threw a black woman out of their restaurant on a cold Tuesday in November. An hour later, the owner was begging. And she fed him anyway. That was the part he never saw coming. That was the part none of them ever do. Some doors get shut in your face your whole life. And then one day you're holding the keys to all of them. And you find out the only thing worth doing with a key is opening the door for the next person who's standing out in the cold. Cora Mae Tillman knew that at 12 years old, crying into her grandmother's apron. It just took the rest of the world a little longer to catch up.